appeared completely disinterested, and during sentencing laughed, yawned, rolled his eyes, and stretched, completely unperturbed by the happenings. Hello my loves, and welcome to episode 29 of Makeup Mayhem True Crime with me, your host, Bella Monsoon. One of the most gang-ridden areas in Cape Town is unfortunately not only home to honest families trying to make a living, but to cruel and calculated killers, often without a tinge of remorse. And with the failure of the justice system, the ever-growing prevalence of gangsterism, and the subculture of violence, innocent lives are lost every single day. Lives are taken by those who only care about power, money, and notoriety above everything else. This episode is about one such individual, a teenager in fact, and the countless lives he destroyed during his 2-year reign of terror. Although his final murder, the murder of Lekita Moore, was the one that made headlines, there are so many other victims that were left in his wake. But before we get into that, for those of you who are new, let me introduce myself. So here it is in a nutshell. I'm a mental health professional who just so happens to be obsessed with makeup, true crime, and uncovering the motives that drive people to do what they do. So basically what that means is that every single week I post a brand new video looking at a real life crime from a psychological viewpoint. During these episodes, I also try to share psychological knowledge and concepts that you may or may not already be aware of in an easy to understand format. So if all of that sounds like something that is just up your alley, then please do consider subscribing and joining the Bella family. And if you want to find me on my other social media channels, I post a variety of different kinds of true crime content. You can find me over here. But if you're more a fan of podcasts, don't worry, I won't hold it against you. I will just direct you right on over to Murder and Mayhem, a South African true crime podcast, which just so happens to be the sister podcast of this series. So just a quick disclaimer for today's story. Today's story contains material citing assault and murder. As always, I mean absolutely no disrespect to any of the victims nor their families. The purpose of this video is to shed further light on the series of heinous crimes that were committed, whilst spreading awareness about the psychological nature of the narrative. This episode has been thoroughly researched by myself and includes real-life accounts, video and footage where available of individuals who involved directly in the case. So let's get to it. Today, I'm going to dive right in to the lives that were changed and destroyed by one young man. Then we're going to dig deeper, and I mean way deeper, to understand the path that led us to this point. Due to the sheer number of crimes committed by this one individual, I'll be making use of a timeline in order to plot out the devastating actions that occurred during this 2-year period. I also just want to make a quick note that during my research, I came across a couple of articles that actually had conflicting reports, which is actually not as uncommon as you may think in the media, especially when there are different news stations reporting on the same crime. But what I did do is I read through about 100 or more articles in order to get a more concrete idea of what happened. But if you do know of any discrepancies, please do let me know in the comment section. So we kick off this episode in October of 2014. This was the month when Alfonso van Rooyen was stabbed in the chest with an Okapi knife. The perpetrator, 17-year-old Cameron Wilson. Alfonso's stepfather would later testify that he was alerted in the middle of the night by his other children, whereafter he had gone 3 doors down from his home and he had found Alfonso lying in the street after he had been stabbed. When he had arrived on the scene, Alfonso had still been alive, but no ambulances were called or had arrived to assist. The family had then loaded him into their bakkie and they had rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately, he had died en route. And just 3 days later, Toya Stober was shot dead. Just a day earlier, Stober had been standing outside, talking to Donovan Morris, Alfonso van Rooyen's stepfather, the one who found him. It was at this point that coincidentally Wilson had walked past, and Stober had pointed him out to Donovan and told him that this was the man who had stabbed Alfonso. Both of the men had then chased Wilson, but he had fled. The next day, Stober and his wife were inside their house shop, which was basically a little shop that they operated from their home, when he had noticed a suspicious character lurking just outside. He had then left the home and he had followed this man, after which they had become embroiled in an argument. The man had then attempted to shoot Stober, but after being unsuccessful, he had fled. Stober, however, was not leaving it there, and he got into his vehicle and he gave chase. A few minutes later, his wife had received a message from the neighbors, telling her that her husband had been shot dead and that his vehicle had crashed into a fence. It would later transpire that Stober's son Armin had actually seen the two men who were responsible for the attack and shooting, one of which was Wilson. He had been walking to his father's home when he had seen his father drive past him, and he watched the entire sordid affair play out. Stober was shot 5 times in the chest and lungs and died on scene. But of course, even though there was an eyewitness, Wilson was innocent. And do you want to know why? Well, because his mom said so. During later court proceedings, his mom, Bridget, had testified that Wilson had been inside playing video games when the shooting had occurred. The reason he was on the scene was not because he was guilty then, it was just because he had run about a kilometer down the road to see what the commotion was about. And so we fast forward a few months to Christmas. On Christmas Day, Ernest Erasmus and his girlfriend, Christeline van Root, who both lived in New Lentegeur, had gone to visit a tavern, basically a local little bar, in Heinz Park, which is just coincidentally where Wilson lived. After having a few drinks, the couple had returned home, where Ernest had realized that he had lost his dacha, his marijuana, along the way. The couple had then walked back the same route that they had taken, and they had found the drugs. Following that, the pair, now that they were back in Heinz Park, they had walked to a place called Angel Sejart, which was an alleged drug den, and it was here that they had stumbled upon trouble, in the form of Wilson, known to them as Wong. He had bumped into the pair and he demanded that Ernest give him 20 rand, which was all the money he had on him. And when Ernest had obviously refused, he had stabbed him in the neck with a screwdriver. Ernest had then shouted for Christeline to run into Angel's place, and she had. Now, this next part doesn't really make sense to me, and these were the only accounts I could find, and they all seem to line up, but I can only assume that the influence of some sort of substance had a role to play in what happened next. Christeline, after this traumatic event, had then gone on to sit inside Angel's place for over an hour. Eventually, she was called outside in regards to Ernest, and so she went outside to look for him, only to be told that his dead body was lying in the soccer field opposite Angel's place. When she arrived on scene, which was almost an hour later, there were detectives and forensics who had told her to remove his belongings. And one of the items on him was still that 20 rand. He was basically killed for nothing. During her testimony in the later trial, amidst Wilson denying this version of events, she had said, "Jy het nie 'n hart nie. Hy praat vuilis. Hy het my man voor my dood gesteek. Jy's 'n gemors, jy." And so we're going fast forward a few more months to April of 2015. Now, just because there are no reported incidents between December and April doesn't mean that nothing occurred. Purely just that we don't have any evidence or witness testimonies to any events. So, in April of 2015, Cody Philander, who was 20 years old at the time, was walking with a friend in their neighborhood when they were approached by Wilson on his BMX bike. Wilson had stopped them and, in his usual bullying fashion, demanded to look in his friend's bag, which his friend was obviously not having. Wilson had then threatened to stab both of them before riding away. The following day, Philander was standing at a house shop when he was once again approached by Wilson. He then recalls Wilson slapping his glasses off of his face. When he had bent down to pick them up, he had been stabbed with an okapi knife. He ended up surviving the attack, and Wilson had run off. The very same month of April, Dawnie Davids was walking across a field when she had bumped into a friend, who just so happened to be Wilson's cousin, and they had started chatting. It was then that she claims that Wilson appeared and he had grabbed her and dragged her to a place near the R300 highway. Here, he had forced her friend to start kicking her and then had instructed him to sit a distance away from the two of them. Dawnie had then asked him, "Wang, wat maak jy dan nou?" But he did not reply, and it was at this point that Wilson proceeded to rape her. She later testified that she shouted for help, but there was no one there to help her. I'm assuming at this point that her friend had been told to leave. She managed to fight him off when he was done, and she started to run away. He gave chase and he ended up stabbing her in the neck. The only reason he ran away was because people, having heard Dawnie's screams, came running down the road shouting. Later forensic testing comparing the DNA that was found on Dawnie's underwear to Wilson's DNA proved to be a positive match. However, Wilson would later refute this claim, saying that the evidence bag had been tampered with in an attempt to incriminate him. He would also go on to claim later in a different story that the sex was consensual, and he had said, "Jy kan sien sy het lekker gekry," stating that if she didn't want it, she would have screamed, and of course, someone would have heard her. And in case you're wondering if this was almost the end of it, no. He was not done yet. This wasn't even the end of his attacks in April. On the 24th of April 2015, two 16-year-old girls were on the way home in Philippi. Abigail Platkies and Stacey Lee Mahale were approached by two boys, Wilson and a boy around the age of 15. The interactions had seemed innocuous at first, but within a few moments, Wilson had pulled a gun on the two girls and he had led them to a nearby abandoned shack, where he had then proceeded to rape Stacey. After finishing with her, he had instructed his accomplice to stab both girls, and he had proceeded to hit them and throw tires over them before setting them alight. Stacey, unfortunately, would not survive the attack, but Abigail made it out, but with serious injuries. But she almost didn't make it out though, as when Wilson had realized that she was still alive, he had instructed the other younger boy with him to throw rocks and bricks at her head. In later testimony, she would recall how her friend Stacey Lee had begged and sobbed for mercy. The resident who found the two girls in the soccer field would later testify that he had initially seen them because he had noticed smoke on the field. He had then gone to look and he had noticed the two girls lying on the floor back to back. Their clothing was on fire and the tire that was burning was closest to the girl who was no longer breathing, Stacey Lee. He had then thrown sand over the fire in an attempt to put it out, and he had called the police. Wilson was arrested shortly after the murder of Mahale, but he was released on bail. He would later go on to say that he was abused by police officers at the precinct where he was arrested, and he was forced to sign documentation that implicated him in the murder of Mahale. These unsubstantiated claims were refuted by both the police and Captain John Pakeman. And so we reach September 2016. At around 1 a.m. on September 11th, Nicole McEwen and a friend had visited a home in the neighborhood to purchase mandrax. Her male friend had entered the house whilst she had remained outside. While waiting, she was approached by two men, one of them being Wilson. Wilson had then asked her for a lighter or matches, both of which she did not have, but this was not the correct answer, and Wilson had then threatened to stab her. He ended up following through on his threat as he stabbed her in the back before fleeing the scene. Later that morning at around 5 a.m., another woman, Rosalind Lackey, was standing at the door of her home when she noticed across the road on the field a woman being attacked by two men. She had approached them to obviously try and stop this, but she was attacked and stabbed and she had a brick thrown at her head. Luckily, a friend had come to her rescue and the two men had run away. She was then immediately taken to hospital as she had several wounds to her head, her face, and her legs. It was later that morning when Lekita Moore's body was discovered. Earlier that morning, Lekita Moore, an 18-year-old girl from Valhalla Park, was on her way home from a karaoke party that was held at the local soccer club when she was attacked. Later that Sunday morning, around 5:30, shortly after Rosalind Lackey's attack, her naked body was discovered in an open field near Tuna Street in Nooit-Gedacht. Shocked residents had alerted the police, and a short while later, the identity of the young girl was discovered. Her father, Charles Moore, had received a call at work from a friend who had told him that his child, his youngest of 3 daughters, was lying dead in a field near the informal settlement in Valhalla Park. Please note the following descriptions are graphic. Later forensic pathology reports would show that she had been stabbed 98 times in the throat and stomach. Her breast and her crotch had been cut at. It also appeared that her legs were broken as a result of the later reports would showcase that she had stab wounds on the back of her head and neck, which indicated that she had attempted to run away during the attack. Wilson, in his later plea bargain, had claimed his innocence, although he admitted to knowing Lekita as her sister was dating his cousin. He claimed that he was at his grandmother's house on the night of the murder. He had left the family braai to then go to the karaoke party where he had seen Lekita. But as he went on to claim, he had not spoken to her and he had left the karaoke party and returned back to his grandmother's home that very night. He had then heard from his cousin the following day that people were looking for him. And then in his later testimony, he would change his narrative again, which was actually quite common, and he would go on to state that he actually knew the identity of Lekita's killer. Like, you can't even make this up. In his second version of events, he claimed that he had seen Lekita argue with a young man, Xavier Bierster, who had then punched her in the face and her nose had begun to bleed. Later that night, she had left the party with a few boys, Wilson and Xavier being 2 of them. The group had then split up and Wilson had then walked with Xavier and Lekita. At this point, the 2, Xavier and Lekita, were arguing and she was threatening to open up a case against him. It was at this point that they had passed the field where Lekita Moore's body was found and Xavier had then stabbed her in the side. And then after he had stabbed her, he jumped on her, he closed her mouth with his hand and he began to stab furiously at her. And apparently, whilst all of this was going on, Wilson had just stood on the sidelines, shocked. Yeah, sounds just like something he would do, judging from his past actions. He then claimed that he had watched Bierster remove Lekita's clothing and begin to mutilate her corpse, after which he had just casually gone home. That's it, he just went home. And in a very strange but potentially convenient turn of events, 17 hours later in that very same field where Lekita Moore's body was found, Xavier Bierster was shot dead. I was unable to ascertain any much more information about the murder, so I don't know whether it was a community killing or if it was Cameron. I do kind of lean towards Cameron though. Xavier Bierster had dropped out of school in grade 6 due to a learning disability, and so he spent majority of his time outside his grandmother's home. However, he lived with his mother Sharon and his sister in Eidsterkamp, an informal settlement. According to rumors of the residents, Bierster was either dating Lekita or he was witness to her murder, and I tend to agree with the latter. especially since Lekita's father and Biesta's mother had both confirmed that their children were single at the time. But then again, parents often don't know a lot that goes on with their children. Biesta's grandmother had gone on to state that he was a good child and he wasn't involved in drugs or with gangs. Wilson's story once again changed, and he claimed that he had wrestled Biesta after the attack, but then shortly after they had both stood up and they had just walked off. And it was at this point that they had apparently met Rosalind Lackey. Remember her? The girl that was hit in the head with a brick and stabbed? And once again, it was not Wilson, but rather Biesta who had attacked her and stabbed her. I mean, that doesn't even make sense given the fact that Rosalind testified to it being Wilson. But anyway, so after Wilson told his narrative, changed his narrative, and then told his narrative again, the truth and the evidence painted a far different picture. Not only did Wilson's grandmother, Mary Wilson, testify that he had only come home the following day, but it would soon become clear that he had indeed left the party with Lekita, as her sister, Mercia, had testified to seeing them leave together. She would later go on to testify that the two had seen each other daily ever since he was released on bail and he was staying at his grandmother's home. And apparently he had been quite possessive over her. And on the night before she was murdered, he had apparently threatened her with a sjambok. Why, you may ask? Well, because he didn't want her to go to that karaoke party. A friend of Lekita's who was at the party would later state that he had hit her and given her a bloody nose on the night too. Although he maintained his innocence, witness testimony contradicting his narrative, as well as DNA evidence that was extracted from the coat he was wearing on the night, ended up being a match to the blood of both Lekita as well as the other woman that he had stabbed on the night. In a strange turn of events, he had actually gone to the police himself after the bodies of Lekita Moore and Biesta were found, and the investigations had begun. His legal counsel would then go on to state, he is not someone who wants to run away from the police, as a way of showcasing his so-called positive traits. After he was arrested, he applied for bail, which was denied by the state, as there were already 6 other cases pending against him, including charges of murder and attempted murder. Yeah, I said 6. In June of 2017, Wilson was convicted on 13 charges: 5 murders, rape, possession of a firearm and ammunition, assault, conspiracy, and 3 counts of attempted murder. He would end up being acquitted on 2 of these counts, for the rape of Mahale as well as the attempted murder of Cody Philander due to lack of evidence. Over 40 witnesses testified during a trial that lasted 51 days. Some of the witnesses were threatened and others just couldn't be found, like Wilson's girlfriend, for example, which I'm assuming was due to the connections and status of Wilson's family, which I will get into shortly. But still, these brave men and women risked their lives to ensure that justice would be served. Lekita Moore's mother, Shireen, suffered a complete breakdown, being committed to Stuckland Psychiatric Hospital. Her husband said, her mind broke. For days she went and slept on the ground where they found Lekita. She very soon after became addicted to tuck, eventually ending up in a rehab facility for months. She was released towards the end of the trial, and she was able to attend a few of the court sessions. Lekita's father would go on to say, he must stay where he is and not get bail. He must die in there. What he did to my child, he'll do to another child. Bring the noose. Hang him. How would I forgive a guy like that? He has done nothing but takes other people's lives. The community was outraged by the shocking crimes of Wilson and mobilized groups of individuals for every day that the case was in court. The public had vocalized notions such as, no one will kill our children and be allowed to get away with it. Either the court makes the killer pay or we will. For a period of time during the trial, he was held in the hospital section of Goodwood Prison due to receiving death threats in jail. During the proceedings and on the day of sentencing, the gallery was full of friends and family members of the victims. When the sentencing was passed down, they applauded and cheered. Although Wilson had pleaded not guilty to all of the charges, the court rejected his version of events and found him guilty. During sentencing, Judge Chantal Fourie gave Wilson 4 life sentences and an additional 71 years to be served concurrently. He received a life sentence for each of the following victims: Toya Stober, Stacey Lee Mahale, Lekita Moore, as well as for the rape of Dawnie David. He was given 15 years for the murder of Alfonso van Rooyen, 15 years for the murder of Ernest Erasmus, 10 years for attempted murder and conspiracy to commit a crime, 10 years for the attempted murder of Rosalind Lackey, 6 years for assault with intent to commit grievous bodily harm, and 5 years for the possession of an unlicensed firearm and ammunition. But guess what? After all he has done and all he is found guilty of, he will still be eligible for parole in 25 years, when he's around 45 years old. And it's almost as though he just couldn't care less. Or at least it appears to be that way to the public eye. During proceedings and sentencing, he wasn't fazed in the least. He appeared completely disinterested, and during sentencing laughed, yawned, rolled his eyes, and stretched, completely unperturbed by the happenings. He even applauded when his sentence was given, and said sarcastically, "At least I'm still alive." And so you knew it was coming, so let's delve into the mind of the murderer. Growing up, Cameron Wilson had lived with his family in Hines Park, near Mitchell's Plain. The community there is known, unfortunately, for experiencing many social ills, such as poverty, gangsterism, drug use, and teenage drinking. This being said, it was alleged that Cameron had come from a loving and stable home, as was told during court proceedings. And this was after a social worker had visited his home and spoken to his siblings and family. He, however, had still later dropped out of school. Judge Chantal Fourie would later state that many individuals who grew up in that area did not go on to do what he did, and she had said, "You never tried to earn an income or complete your schooling. Instead, you roamed the streets." It was no secret, however, that his father was an alleged prominent figure of the 28's gang, as well as someone who was charged and accused of multiple murders. Abraham Wilson, 37 years old, had appeared in court in June of 2017. Yes, during the same time as his son's trial, on 3 charges of murder and 1 of attempted murder, in connection to the drive-by shooting and murder of a Cape Flats gospel singer, Wilton Fredericks. He was arrested following a tip-off by community members who expressed the notion that they were tired of the ever-increasing gang violence in their communities. Right, so for those of you who are not aware or are perhaps not from South Africa, let's do a quick 101 on South African gangs, the 28's in particular. The 28's are part of the Numbers Gang, a gang initially started in prisons. They are one of 3. The 26's, the 27's, and the 28's. Honestly, there is so much information, testimony from ex-gang members, books and resources on this, but I am going to sum it up in the simplest way possible. The 26's are tasked with accumulating wealth for the Numbers Gang. Not too much is known about the 27's, as they are the most secretive of the bunch, with their main task being to enforce the laws between the Numbers gang members. And lastly, the 28's. They are responsible for fighting on behalf of all 3 gangs. Thus, they are the most prevalent in prison too. They are divided into 2 lines: gold, the males, and silver, the females. There is also not much communication between the 26's and 28's. Everything is run through the 27's. In addition, each group has different rankings, much like the army. The more you accumulate, whether it be money in the case of the 26s or victims in the case of the 28s, the higher your potential is to rise up through the ranks. Higher rank means more power. More power means more control and more reward. Being part of a gang in or out of prison can drastically alter the experience of an individual. Not only in terms of protection, but also in terms of income and opportunities. An ex-gang member, who I will mention shortly, stated that he was earning 500,000 Rand a month whilst he was in prison. Yeah, I'm gonna let that one sink in. In areas that are very well known for gangsterism, belonging to a gang is almost a badge of honor and respect. The ex-gang member whom I previously mentioned, Welcome Witboy, had gone on to explain how attending school was seen as pathetic, whereas running the corners or working with the gang members was seen as something to be proud of. Fear fosters respect. In that way, and with that mindset, the presence of gangs psychologically change and impact the environment in which they operate. So, what is a gang? Well, in short, an urban phenomenon often found in cities around the world where there is low income and often a subculture of violence. Gangs mostly exist in areas where there are already significant risk factors. As I have previously mentioned within the psychology of cults in the Krugersdorp Killers video, gangs offer individuals an opportunity and experience that they feel as though they are lacking in their current existence. The main risk factors include a host of socioeconomic factors, such as poverty, violence in the community, substance abuse, and a lack of education. By offering membership to a gang, the leaders offer not only a form of income, but a family that many of these at-risk teenagers are desperately seeking. Broken homes are unfortunately commonplace in many socioeconomically disadvantaged areas. Many children grow up with absent fathers and are subjected to social disruptions both inside and outside of the home. But that doesn't mean that every child from a gang-ridden area will grow up to join a gang or even become an offender. But growing up in that environment as a child is detrimental. And if there are additional mental health factors, for example, a personality disorder, at play, it can often lead to disastrous consequences. Cameron Wilson displayed dangerous behavior from a young age before reaching adulthood. He grew up surrounded by gangsterism, with his father, who was his role model, being a prominent role player in the 28s. The allure of the gang life potentially took hold of him at a very early age, and that, combined with his diagnosed lack of empathy, spelled disaster for everyone that he encountered. His need to impress his father, the gang, or potentially both, may have driven him time and time again to do the unthinkable in the pursuit of respect. I have no doubt that his father's reputation and standing affected him in some way and form. His actions reflect the subculture of violence that underwrites the gang life. The more violence committed, the more respect that is earned. Many also believe that the murder and mutilation of Lekita Moore was done as a gang initiation, and many may be incredibly correct in that assumption. During the trial, Wilson was said to have joined the 28s, and the evidence of this was his new tattoo on his hand in clear sight of any and everyone. The power that is received from the acts committed serve as positive reinforcement to continue perpetrating, as the reward is seen to be worth the risk. And that being said, going to prison only serves to further aid the rise of rank. Another aspect which was heavily spoken about after the murder of Lekita Moore was the failing of the judicial and criminal prison system. During a documentary I watched recently, an inmate at Pollsmoor Prison had stated that prisons are just warehouses for criminals, stating that he and many others were booked in and were serving time for petty thefts and misdemeanors, but it was there that they had learned about far more serious crimes and had the opportunity to join a gang. Now, there isn't really a way to prevent this given the widespread nature of gangs, both within Cape Town and in South Africa in general. The further downside is that it's not only the criminals that are involved. Police officers, high-ranking officials, and many others are potentially involved. So honestly, where do you begin to fix the broken system? And if you can't fix the system, where else do you start? Well, I'm pretty sure as a true crime fan, which I'm assuming you are as you are here, you will be familiar with the debate about nature versus nurture. Basically, the question is, are people born evil, or is evil bred and created through the events and moments experienced throughout a lifetime? Well, we've kind of touched on the nurture side, but let's talk about the nature side. In Cameron Wilson's case, the psychologist who examined Wilson during his 51-day trial and sentencing submitted their reports to the court, which declared that he indeed was a serial killer and a psychopath. The court heard from forensic psychiatrist Professor Sean Kaliski, who deemed Wilson a danger to society and stated that he appears to be unmoved by the years behind bars he faces. The documents would go on to further state that he has a very limited chance of being rehabilitated. And given the fact that South Africa does not have a specialized rehabilitation program for serial killers, this chance is even slimmer. So at this point you may be asking, okay Bella, he's a psychopath, but what does that mean? If you're familiar with psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder, as it is clinically known, you will already kind of know the traits that Wilson possesses. So in terms of antisocial personality traits, there is an evident lack of remorse with Wilson, displayed through his flagrant disregard of the actions and attacks he committed. He also went on to show absolutely zero sympathy to the families of his victims. During his trial, he laughed, smirked, and honestly didn't seem to care about what was happening around him. He would even pitch up to court in shirts that said, "Born to hustle, destined for greatness." Judging by his charges and convictions, he was also extremely impulsive, continuously violating the rights of others with no regard for their safety or well-being. It was almost as though he received some sort of psychological gratification from the acts he committed. He showed hostility and aggression through many of the acts that witnesses testified to. This is also evident on his social media profile. There is also a distinct lack of emotional intelligence, which is a key factor in preventing an individual from committing a crime. Given the fact that personality disorders are stable and thus highly unlikely to change over the course of a lifetime, it may not be possible to fully treat or reform such an individual. And seeing as though he committed more crimes whilst out on bail signals that there is a very real chance that he may remain a serious risk to the community for years to come. At least, in my opinion, that is. This is also why he received the sentence that he did, regardless of his age. The prosecutor, Corrine Tiernissen, had said, "There were substantial and compelling reasons for the court to deviate from the prescribed minimum sentences. He was cruel and the crimes he committed were very gruesome. He disrespected women and enjoyed manipulating them, and where they defied him, he lashed out at them." His abuse of women could also be linked to his learned love of power, domination, and control. Using a knife during a murder indicates a high level of rage, as well as intimacy, and the mutilation of her body could point to not only a gang initiation, but also an act of sadism. But once again, without an in-depth study of Cameron and his life, it's impossible to tell. Although not much is known, or at least publicly spoken, about Cameron in his youth, it can be deduced from statements and witnesses that he had a history of violence, and not only that, but a history of violence against women. I also discovered through my research that he has a 2-year-old child whom he has had absolutely zero contact with since the day it was born. And that's probably for the better too. An inability to form close and healthy relationships and connections is also yet another characteristic of this personality affliction. Later court documents also revealed that Cameron had terrorized the Hines Park community for years. Cameron Wilson may be a diagnosed psychopath and serial killer, but there are so many other factors at play that have created the person that he is today. The relationship he had to the gang life, as well as the socio-economic environment in which he existed in, make diagnosing just one factor of causality near impossible. I could spend hours discussing how all the interacting factors played a role, and at the end, we still would not be able to just pinpoint one. That being said, none of these factors excuse his behavior or exempt him from the punishment that he deserves. Although justice may have technically been served and Cameron Wilson is in jail, he has left behind a trail of destruction and trauma. His victims suffered such cruel and untimely fates, and their families are forever impacted by his actions. And when something like this happens, who do we look to point the finger at? Was it the socio-economic conditions that surrounded him? Was it the influence of gangs and the subculture of violence in the community? Was it something he was born with? Or was it just blatant disregard and lack of humanity? What do you think? Thank you for sticking with me through yet another episode. I will catch you all next week. Until then, stay safe, stay awesome, and stay the amazing human beings that I know you all are. Bye!